We turn again to Galatians and chapter 2. Last week we were considering the battle that Paul fought with false brethren in order to preserve the gospel in its purity. And this is a battle that the true prophets of God have had to fight throughout the 20 centuries of the Christian church. A continuous battle with false brethren who seek to bring people into bondage by emphasizing external rituals at the cost of inward reality. In those days it was circumcision, in these days it may be something else. But always, when the emphasis is on the external, then we know that we are on dangerous ground. We believe in the externals, but if the inward reality is missing, then the ones who emphasize the externals are Pharisees. One of the clearest marks of the Pharisees was that they had the externals right, but their inward life was corrupt. That's what Jesus said. You make the outside of the cup clean, but the inside is dirty. You tithe your mint and anise and cumin and all these seeds in your kitchen garden. You gather them up and take 10% of it and give it to God. But much more important things like loving others and being merciful and compassionate to poor widows who can't pay your house rent. You're not doing that. What's the use of your going through these external rituals and fasting and praying and being circumcised? They are worthless without the other. It doesn't mean that they didn't have to be circumcised or didn't have to tithe. He said, these ought ye to have done, but not to leave the other undone. So it's not that we don't believe in the external things, but that they have no value apart from the inward reality. And false brethren are those who think and who concentrate on the externals. By the externals we mean going to meetings and reading the Bible and the external act of prayer meetings and breaking of bread and baptism and all these external things. On witnessing and evangelism and all this. This is all external. It's all very good. It's all commanded by God and all things that we need to keep. Just like circumcision was commanded by God. And tithing was commanded by God. But there was a time in the Old Testament where God said through Isaiah, I'm fed up of your Sabbaths and all your rituals because the inward reality is missing. That's what he would say even today through the prophets to the church. And he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. I'm fed up of all your breaking your bread meetings and your prayer meetings and your baptism. You're still sinning in your thought life. You don't love one another fervently. What's the use of these external rituals? And that's where we need to take up the battle for the truth of the gospel. That the gospel brings a change inwardly, not just makes us conform to certain external rituals. Paul said, we did not yield subjection to them, Galatians 2:5, to these false brethren, even for an hour. And it was a tremendous battle. It was a battle that finally made Paul the enemy of all these Jewish leaders. They accused him and finally got him locked up in prison. That's the price we may have to pay. Some were killed because they stood for the truth of the gospel. But we must be willing to lay down our life if necessary for the sake of preserving the truth of the gospel. We read further in verse 6, Galatians 2, but from those who were of high reputation. By that he means those who were esteemed in the church. Then he says, in parenthesis, in brackets, what they were makes no difference to me because God shows no partiality. He says, I'm not particularly concerned by the fact that they had an esteem because God shows no partiality. However, since they were respected in the church, he submitted his gospel to them, and these who were of reputation in the church contributed nothing to the gospel that Paul was proclaiming. They confirmed it. They said, that's right. That's what we preach too. On the contrary, Paul says in verse 7, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter with the gospel to the circumcised. They recognized, we read in verse 9, the grace that had been given to me. God calls us to different ministries, and God called Paul particularly to proclaim this gospel to the non-Jews, including the Jews, but especially to the non-Jews. And Peter had been called to proclaim the gospel, particularly to the Jewish community. And he says in verse 8 that the same God who effectually worked for Peter in his apostleship to the Jews effectually worked for me also to the non-Jews. It's the same God, different ministries, different spheres of ministry. And they had the grace, those apostles, to recognize that these two men had been called and equipped by God through their past experience and training for specific ministries in different areas. There was no competition there, and there was no question of conflict. Absolutely none. It was just that they worked in different spheres, but the gospel they both proclaimed was exactly the same. And it says here that these apostles recognized, verse 9, the grace that had been given to me. And then he refers to the three pillars in the church. James, not the apostle, but the elder brother, the physical elder brother of Jesus, who was converted after the resurrection of Jesus, as far as we know in 1 Corinthians 15, who finally became one of the elders of the church in Jerusalem and the spokesman of the early church. And Peter and John, James and Peter and John, who were reputed to be pillars, the chief elders of the church in Jerusalem. Peter and John the apostles, and James also an apostle, but not one of the first 12, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we might go to the non-Jews and they to the Jews. They gave Paul and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. Said, you're called to a different ministry. We're called to a different ministry. Let's fellowship together. But the gospel, both proclaimed, was exactly the same. And the only thing that James, Peter, and John emphasized was, we must remember the poor. Which Paul says I was also very eager to do. For after all, the good news of the gospel is something that saves us from sin and brings us into a fervent love for the brotherhood. And that fervent love will certainly make us consider the poor in the church, and to do good to all men, especially to those who are of the household of faith. And so in this whole passage we see Paul seeking confirmation from those who were the leaders in the church, not yielding even one part of the truth of the gospel, so that he might keep the gospel pure, so that people might come into liberty, and willing to fight with the false brethren if need be. We are called to peace, but when it comes to keeping the truth of the gospel, we have to wage a tremendous warfare against many religious leaders who would seek to keep others in bondage. And we read further in verse 11, when Cephas, that's Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him. Yes, Paul even had to oppose Peter at one point, when Peter compromised to his face because he stood condemned. Paul did not respect the face of any man, because he says, prior to the coming of certain men from James in Jerusalem, Peter used to eat with the non-Jews. But when those people came, he began to withdraw and stopped eating with the non-Jews, fearing the Jewish circumcision party in the church. And Paul said, that is compromising. Why do you seek to fear men? If you fear men, you cannot be the servant of Christ. And the rest of the Jews joined him in his hypocrisy. And he says, even Barnabas was carried away by their hypocrisy and wanted to avoid eating with the non-Jews. And he says, when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, he rebuked Peter in the presence of everybody. He says, if you being a Jew live like the non-Jews and not like the Jews, how is it that you compel the non-Jews to live like the Jews? And there we see how eager Paul was to take up this battle to preserve the truth of the gospel, even if it meant that someone whom he esteemed very highly, like Peter, compromised, he would stand against him. There's a great need, dear friends, in these days for men like Paul, men of the caliber of Paul, who do not fear the face of any man, who do not seek the honor of any man. And even if there's someone whom they esteem, if they see him compromising, they will oppose him to preserve the truth of the gospel and to preserve the gospel in all its purity. And this is the great need. Paul was a man who did not seek to please men, not even Peter, his good friend. There's a great need for men like that even today.